Hello guys, welcome to another edition of React today as part of the World's Way Out project. Today we're going to speak about the inevitable circumstances in which the world is in right now, and that is what happened 7 days ago when Hamas, a group that does not represent the totality of the people in Palestine, it's a group that has been elected democratically in the elections in the past decades to be the guidance in order for the Palestinian people to be represented in the rest of the world, has become a terrorist group according to the United States, Europe, the UK. There's a few countries around the world that doesn't recognize Hamas. Maybe they have changed their minds after what happened 7 days ago. Tomorrow, when this organization attacked Israel, assassinating with no mercy whatsoever hundreds of civilians in a concert, smoking weed and having a good time, drinking, just enjoying the techno festival, having some fun. And all of a sudden, people seeing Glade flyers, whatever their name is, to those parachutes that have an engine, a little motor, and it was modified in order to carry a weapon. And they assassinated 200 innocent civilians. It was something that we all rejected, still do. And it was something that the Israeli government didn't expect it, but it happened. There's many questions to get to the point we're going to talk about today. Was this planned by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? It's a hypothesis that began running in the last couple days because he was losing power and his own government was on peril because he wanted to dissolve the characteristics of a democracy, or a republic, which are the three powers, the division of powers, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. He wanted to become with the extreme far right that characterizes now this coalition of government that the Israelis have nowadays. And his term as a prime minister was at risk. We have to understand that Israel has been on elections like 3 times in the last 5 years. Something that has never happened before in Israel. With the attacks on last Saturday morning, the people of Israel united. The coalition government united. The division of powers, of course, right now doesn't exist. It's going to be nothing but a totalitarian regime for one cause and one cause only. And that cause is to destroy the Palestinian people instead of using the intelligence they have that is so famous, which is put to trial right now because it didn't work whatsoever. The American cooperation with Israel, the United Kingdom cooperation, the MI6, MI5, and intelligent organisms of the United States, Europe, and the United Kingdom didn't work whatsoever. Why was that? Nobody knows yet. And up until then, the government of Benjamin Netanyahu was in crumbles. It was crumbling like an old building. Why all of a sudden this attack happens on Israel? I asked that question, and it's a question that we all here in Canada and all around the world are asking ourselves, and we're saying, okay, how can that happen? Is it that the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to keep himself in power in order to advance his political agenda? Whether it's a political agenda or not is something we're going to see today. If it's a political or just a madness agenda in order to keep him in power. Because he loves power so much and he guarantees the existence of Israel no matter what. And that is the code word in order to say, only I have the power to keep free Israel and democratic. Well, democracy was in crumbles, and that's why millions of people all around Israel protested against Benjamin Netanyahu and his coalition government because he wanted to exclude the people's right to have a democracy itself, which is constituted, I repeat, by the legislative, the executive, and the judicial apparatuses that conform a state with the military, of course. But those are the basic ones in order to constitute a democracy or a republic. All right. The fact that this attack happened without Israel noticing, even though they have artificial intelligence, even though they have people on the ground in Gaza, I'm talking about thousands of Israeli infiltrated in the Palestinian territory, whether in Gaza or the West Bank. But we are asking, well, how can that be? How can that happen? And they're cataloging this assault as the 9/11 of Israel against Israel. That's a curious name to put it this way, because if you remember well, the 2001 attacks on 9/11, attacks on New York City against the towers, was absolutely planned, and nobody knew. And the same happened with the Americans, that the most powerful country in the world, with 16 agencies that dedicate their time to intelligence services, didn't notice. Homeland Security didn't found out, the Air Force Intelligence Services didn't know, and all of a sudden 4 planes attacked different places that we know in September 11, 2001, destroying the 2 towers and of course causing the war against terrorism. What a coincidence that these people are calling this attack, I mean the Israeli government, a 9/11 of Israel, and they use this excuse to attack Gazan people, innocent people, and destroy them. Yes, we understand here in Canada that what happened against the Israeli people was anathema. I mean, how could that happen? I mean, the pain and the sorrow of the families, the people that have been kidnapped, the soldiers assassinated, more than 200 now, and mainstream media, all in favor of Israel. Like in the same what happened in 2001 events in New York against America, the communications, the mainstream media went immediately to say that this was to condemn, and instead of finding the causes to this attack, they just dedicated and have dedicated the last 7 days in order to say that we need to destroy Hamas. That's what the government says, but the people in Israel are saying that it doesn't matter if all Palestine is deleted from the map. It doesn't matter because they have been attacked. So we all know that the Israeli people are very belligerent. Since they are very young people, the kids are trained in the thinking that they deserve to be recognized by the whole world, and the whole world is to recognize them no matter what they do, and they can do that with total impunity. They can kill the press, members of press for other countries. They can kill Palestinians whenever they feel like, and they can go to other countries and kill whomever they feel like because it's against their principles. In other words, what they're saying as a democracy is that they can kill anyone and anything or any country or any government that opposes them, period. And you can see now, after what happened, that we Canadians deplore and don't accept what happened against the innocent civilians that were killed in the assassination plot against Israeli civilians. It's unacceptable. But as in 2001, the media has promoted and pushing the agenda of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with the support of the United States and the biggest plane carriers, Air Force carriers, the Gerald Ford, in order to go to the Mediterranean and assist Israel in whatever is going on or may happen with the terrorist organization Hamas. So today we're going to not only speak about that, because I can go for hours about that, and as a citizen I am concerned about what the implications are going to be regarding the support of Canadian Prime Minister and the next Prime Minister regarding these issues, Israel. And the support for Israel is unconditional.
Mr. Polyev, Over here, it's Brady Strachan with CBC. Should Israel's right to defend itself, do you think, extend to justifying cutting off electricity, food shipments to Gaza, even for humanitarian purposes?
First of all, this is, I think, the first time I've had a chance to comment in person since Hamas's unprovoked, sadistic, terrorist attack, the most deadly attack on Israel in its history. We unreservedly condemn Hamas for this attack, and our heart breaks for every lost innocent life, both Palestinian and Israeli. Let us remember that every loss of life in this conflict is the direct consequence of Hamas's conduct. Hamas is a sadistic, genocidal, terrorist death cult, and it must be stopped. And unfortunately, its evil and odious conduct is responsible for all of the suffering that we witness right now. So conservatives call for the government to take action to counter Hamas any way we can. And one way would be to impose more severe sanctions on Iran, which is the sponsor of Hamas, and to criminalize the IRGC, which is the terrorist arm of the Iranian government that coordinates support for Hamas and Hezbollah. It is perfectly legal right now for Iran to use Canada as a staging ground for the IRGC, which is the worst terrorist organization in the world. And conservatives are calling for the Trudeau government to finally ban the IRGC so that Iran can no longer use our country to carry out its evil works.
Without asking the people, just the mainstream media is cutting off whoever thinks different, the persons that are being invited, in order to speak about the causes and the consequences that this can have, not only for Israel, against Israel itself. Now that Israel was having conversations with Saudi Arabia in order to become best pals and have relations regarding oil, trade, a political understanding, economic understanding, and not only with Saudi Arabia, with Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, etc. So it seems to me that comes very conveniently for the government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to have war, because war unites people more than any other thing around one cause, and that is vengeance. And if you see the interviews and the people in Israel, of course, with due reason, they are angry and they want vengeance, and they want nothing but vengeance. And the vengeance have non-stop since the Saturday attacks. Nothing but vengeance. Innocent people have been destroyed. They say that they're destroying Hamas and only attacking Hamas. We all know that is not true. That is a total lie. Even though the mainstream media in India, in the UK, in the United States, here in Canada, only focuses on the vengeance with reason, because Israel has the right to defend itself, and that's it. They don't want to look for the causes or the principles or the history behind it. They just, and you Canadians and I as a Canadian and everybody in Europe and all around the world has to support Israel no matter what. It doesn't matter if they commit genocide against a whole nation. In this case, just one of the parts, because there's the West Bank and there's Gaza. And people need to leave because we are gonna destroy everybody in the name of Hamas. We need to destroy Hamas. And it's understandable. Vengeance, it's what they're doing, screaming for vengeance. But in that process, they're killing and destroying civilians. That has nothing to do with the attack on Israel. And the problem is that as belligerent, like I said, the Israeli people are educated since childhood in order to understand that they and only them have the right to exist around the world, and that is the only democracy. And they can go to other countries and kill everybody that opposes them, etc. They have done it in many places, including Europe, not only Iran, to kill their scientists and to kill their generals, etc. whomever they deem necessary to get killed because they don't like or opposes their ideology, extreme ideology, far-right ideology, criminal ideology, as has been demonstrated in the last week.
As we turn right now to Sven-Ken van Bergsdorf, a former EU, European Union ambassador to the occupied Palestinian territory, served in that post up until July. Your response to this order by the Israeli military that half the population of Gaza must move within a 24-hour period starting last night from the north to the south. Sven-Ken van Bergsdorf.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Goodman. And of course, I can fully second what Mohammed Shahada has so well described as the absolute catastrophe which 2 million Gazans are facing. Let me start by saying I'm fully aware of this deep hate and frustration and despair which befell the Israeli society. And when they speak of their 9/11, of what happened last Saturday, I understand, of course, that view and that emotional tension they are under right now. And that makes it so difficult to have a rational discussion, not only in Israel, but also in Europe and in the US. But we have to be aware that we still are governed by international law. We have left the medieval times. We have rules of conduct for war. We have rules of conduct of how apply humanitarian principles. And no matter what Hamas did, it does not justify the incredible use of lethal force without distinction and without proportionality as far as the Palestinian population is concerned in Gaza. Distinction, proportionality, and precaution are sacrosanct principles for the code of conduct of armed hostilities. And Israel, as a democracy, cannot escape that and has to be held accountable. It cannot be that Israel has a carte blanche because terrible acts, brutal, gruesome acts happened to 1,000 or even 1,200 Israelis. That is not the excuse you can use to flatten Gaza and not come back to the point of what you exactly ask. The announcement of the IDF to basically forcibly evict more than 1 million Gazans from their homes in the northern part of the Strip is likely to be criticized by international legal experts as a war crime. If there is no provision made for ensuring humanitarian access and exit and the necessary facilities to accommodate the basic human rights to water, energy, food, and physical safety, let alone health. And this is also clearly signed in all international conventions Israel has ratified and is accountable to. So it is unexcusable if the international community does not use its pressure point to hold Israel to account to what they have pledged before the international community to respect. I understand the emotions. They are very high right now in Israel. I'm in retirement right now in France, so I'm not more on the post, but I can understand that. But as I said, we all have to uphold international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. That is the yardstick. That is the most important measure of conduct for all of us.
I want to turn to Ursula Gertrude von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, who arrived in Israel today, and play for you a comment she made last year about Russia targeting civilian infrastructure in Ukraine.
War crimes, targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure with the clear aim to cut off men, women, children of water, electricity and heating with the winter coming. These are acts of pure terror, and we have to call it as such.
So she's talking about what Russia is doing in Ukraine. Would this also apply to Israel and Palestine?
International law applies everywhere. Human rights are universal, indivisible, and inalienable. This is the EU position across the world.
Let me ask you about a statement by Jan Egeland, the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council. He's got dozens of workers in Palestine. We just spoke to Yusuf yesterday from the Jabalia refugee camp is where he lives. He came in, talked about the difficulty of even moving to be able to talk to us, to find a space that had electricity. Today, we can't reach people in Gaza. But Jan Egeland, the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, commented on the Israeli relocation ultimatum of Gaza civilians, saying the Israeli military demand that 1.2 million civilians in northern Gaza relocate to its south within 24 hours, absent of any guarantees of safety or return, would amount to the war crime of forcible transfer. It must be reversed, he said. Your response, Sven Kuhn van Bergsdorf.
I fully subscribe to the statement of Jan Egeland. As an international legal expert, as a political scientist, as a former diplomat, and as a human being, there is no doubt that this has to be respected. And by the way, let me just underline this. If Israel decides to close its crossings in Kerem Shalom and in Erez, Egypt is bound by international law to open its border crossing in Rafah. And it cannot be that Israel threatens to bomb corridors and transports carrying humanitarian facilities and equipment. It cannot be. This is another war crime if that would take place. Egypt also has to ensure that its obligations towards refugees under international law are fully respected. So it's not just ensuring that in the space of the south, if one were actually to displace people, all the facilities are there, fully knowing that this amounts already, this forced eviction, to a war crime, but also the ability for people to be able to exit for humanitarian reasons. This highly dense populated strip in Gaza in the south would also mean for Egypt to open its borders. And of course, the international community of providing the necessary provisions to facilitate that people can live there. Again, this can only be a temporary solution. It cannot be that, as Mohammed Shahada said, we are basically witnessing a second Nakba, whereby the entire Gazan population is forcibly evicted from their homeland, which is Gaza, from their homes. And that is also something I think we have clearly to underline when talking to Israel and when engaging with them on finding a solution. Let me just say an important thing right now. The key political measure right now is to de-escalate and stop any further war crime and try to ensure that the people of Gaza are fully safe and protected. And of course, I understand that there's an important issue of freeing the hostages. I don't know whether it's 150 or whatever the number is. But it's very important that this process be done as soon as possible and through negotiations. This is also a very important element which we have to be aware of. So humanitarian access and exit and freeing the hostages and de-escalating are the three key, I think, objectives one has to engage on now.
We want to thank you for being with us, Sven Kuhn van Bergsdorf, former EU ambassador to the occupied Palestinian territory, served in that post up until July, speaking to us from France.
Many people in Canada opposes this determination by the Prime Minister of Canada regarding this issue because it's not taking on account history. And as we're going to see today, I want to refresh the memory of Canadians and Europeans and whomever's in this program. I hope it's not going to be cancelled like it's becoming the custom of this platform, for telling the truth. Now, what we're going to tell the truth, yes, Israel has the right to defend itself, so does Palestine, and so does any other country, but Israel has one particularity, and it's that they always break international law and they don't care. And they are not found accountable or responsible for any or every time that they break international law or amnesty international rules of war or all these issues. So let's begin with some history here that I would like you to remember in order to understand the conflict between Palestine and Israel. And this is just one part, guys. It's just one part that I want to refresh your memory in, including the the Israeli people in order to understand why is this happening, why Palestine is so submitted, like literally submitted with no water, no electricity, but just a few hours a day, and these people live in absolute poverty and misery, while people in Israel live in absolute oligarchical grounds, overdeveloping and reaching way farther than was permitted according to accords signed in 1967, etc., in order to divide the two states to live in peace and accordingly with international law. This is not happening. I'm not an anti-Semite. I'm just saying that if we need to understand history, is to hear from Canada, to have a position that not necessarily has to be the same one as the Prime Minister did with the pandemic, and is to have to obey, because otherwise, if you don't obey, you're a fringe minority and you're against us. No, we are not against anybody here. We are looking for democracy, for truth, for accountability, for responsibility, and for justice. For the Hamas people that committed those crimes against the Jews last Saturday, absolutely yes. The whole weight of the law, international and the Jewish, of course, state, which was the state that was attacked. But today we're going to refresh your memory, Canadians, Europeans, and whomever's in this program, in order to understand the conflict between Palestine and the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Welcome.
The bitter struggle between Arab and Jew for control of the Holy Land has caused untold suffering in the Middle East for generations. It is often claimed that the crisis originated with Jewish emigration to Palestine and the foundation of the State of Israel. Yet the roots of the conflict are to be found much earlier, in British double-dealing during the First World War. This is a story of intrigue among rival empires, of misguided strategies, and of how conflicting promises to Arab and Jew created a legacy of bloodshed which has determined the fate of the Middle East.
During the First World War, the British, the French, and the Russians had these secret plans to carve up the Ottoman Empire because they believed that would balance out their imperial ambitions, but tough luck for the Turks, the Arabs, and anyone else who got in the way.
Certainly, all the seeds were planted then, in the sense that it was the British who promised the Arabs independence on the one hand, and a Jewish homeland on the other, and you could not simply reconcile one with the other.
The British scattered promises to anyone who might be of some use to them without thinking about the consequences. So British duplicity, British double-dealing went a long way to perpetuate the conflict in Palestine.
At the end of the day, when you're fighting a war, you are very liberal in what you're offering in terms of a post-war settlement. When you get down to the conference table when the war has ended and you have to start honoring your agreements, you then have to decide what's in your interest or not. And the British saw the Middle East as a Western flank for their power in India and their power in Asia in general.
The story of Britain's involvement in the Middle East and the ensuing struggle between Arab and Jew begins with her colonial past. At the beginning of the 20th century, King Edward VII ruled over a vast empire with interests in every part of the world.
India became increasingly important because it was the second pillar of British power in the world. Moving the Indian army about was extremely important in extending British interests and British influence across the globe. And the Suez Canal was, of course, the quick way to do that. It's very important for the British geopolitical position to ensure the Suez Canal remains safe and secure.
With this aim in mind, Britain had become the only European power to establish a major foothold in the Middle East, in the principalities around the Persian Gulf, in Aden, and in Egypt. Britain had annexed Egypt from Turkey's Ottoman Empire in 1882, and by the time it was made a protectorate in 1914, Cairo had become the centre of British power in the Middle East. The presence of imperial troops in the region was of vital strategic importance, for the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Muhammad V was in alliance with Britain's much-feared rival, Germany. Together with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, these countries made up the Central Powers, and pitted against them were the three allies, Britain, France, and Russia.
Discover the past with exclusive history documentaries from History Hit and uncover the secrets of some of the most famous people and events in history. History Hit brings you the stories that shaped the world through exclusive documentaries from the world's top historians. Travel with us to the bloody Battle of Stalingrad or uncover the lives of the people who called Pompeii home. We also aim to bring you the stories and legends that shaped our world through our award-winning podcast network. Sign up now for a free trial, and Timeline fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code TIMELINE at checkout.
From the Ottoman capital, Constantinople in Turkey, the Sultan ruled over the last of the great Islamic empires. It had been in almost terminal decline for decades. Yet the fate of the Ottoman Empire was to be sealed by the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914. In Europe, Germany's rapid advance was halted by Britain and France along the Western Front. In the east, Russia's war against Germany and Austria-Hungary also reached deadlock. The powerful weapons of the industrial age were killing thousands of men in the trenches of every army.
All of the leading powers expected the war to be over within a matter of months. So in that sense, all of them are surprised at the end of 1914, when not merely is the war going on, but it shows every sign of being likely to go on for a very long time. At that point, they began to think about new ways of winning the war.
Britain's Prime Minister Asquith felt that with the stalemate in Europe, it was essential to widen the conflict. Together with Foreign Secretary Lord Grey, Minister for War Lord Kitchener, and the First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill, they masterminded a complex strategy to undermine the Central Powers.
This was a global war, and the British saw the Middle East very much in a global context. The traditional British preference for sideshows, as people unfavourably call it, the indirect strategy, the way of attacking the soft underbelly, as Churchill called it, of the enemy. And the soft underbelly was seen to be Turkey.
Britain's secret plan involved on the one hand a military diversion, and on the other a devious use of diplomacy through bribery, subversion and double-dealing. All these devices focused on the enemy's weakest link, Turkey's Ottoman Empire.
Diplomacy in general has always had a secret dimension to it, but where discretion ends and conspiracy begins is an open question. But during the period up to and during the First World War, there was a particularly intense set of negotiations and discussions between the major imperial powers, between the French, the Russians, and the British in particular, cutting in the Italians as well, about what would they do when the war was over and when the Ottoman Empire broke up.
The British government hoped that by striking a deal over the spoils of war, it would strengthen the alliance against the Central Powers. Amongst the Allies, Russia had long sought access to the Mediterranean. In a secret treaty of March 1915, Britain and France offered what was to the Tsar a prize of vital geopolitical importance, Constantinople.
It is that key outlet into the wider world and into the Mediterranean. And it is the one thing, of course, the British and the French have been attempting to prevent the Russians from achieving. So this is a complete volte-face. This is the British, the French and the Russians coming to an agreement over something which was, up to this point, almost inconceivable.
Italy's King Vittorio Emanuele was another target for bribery. Britain, France and Russia tried to tempt Italy, a pro-German state, to join the Allies. In April 1915, a secret treaty offered Italy a substantial bit of Ottoman real estate in Anatolia.
Again, it's another power coming into the equation and being offered territorial advancement, which in normal circumstances would have been quite inconceivable.
The bribe worked. Italy joined the Allies and declared war on the Central Powers in August 1915. But Britain's strategy to undermine the enemy via the Ottoman Empire also required subversion. By using domestic opposition to weaken, maybe even destroy it, Britain exploited a new movement sweeping through the empire: nationalism.
Nationalism in the sense of believing that there are peoples with a clear cultural identity and that these people should have independent. That idea spread to the Middle East as to other parts of the world in the latter part of the 19th century. So you had the beginnings in the Ottoman Empire of a Turkish nationalism.
This came to a head when the Young Turks took power in a coup in 1908 and started to impose their language and culture on the Arabs of the empire. But this only reawakened an interest amongst Arabs in their own heritage. A 1,000 years before, Arabs had brought the technology and literature of the East to the West, and their religion, Islam, had encompassed much of Asia, North Africa, and southwestern Europe. The idea of recovering that historic grandeur had remained in the consciousness of Arab intellectuals. By the start of the First World War, the antagonism between Arab and Turk had increased.
The very fact that the Turks were saying, we want to have a unified empire, meant the Arabs said, wait a minute, we're not part of this. So all of this literary and nationalistic revival then took a much more political form, and therefore you got the emergence of Arab nationalism.
They had arrived at the conclusion that remaining in the Ottoman Empire was becoming hopeless, that they couldn't actually share power with the Turks. And they began thinking of having their own state.
By the summer of 1915, British intelligence confirmed that the Arab nationalist movement was the breakthrough the government was looking for. Britain and her French ally dispatched officers to sound out Arab leaders.
Both the French and the British started, you could say, seducing various local Arab leaders that if you side with us, we'll give you your independence. So why don't you leave the Ottomans? And various people were tempted as a result. If they thought they could actually gain independence, why not side with the Europeans against the Ottomans?
The idea was to tempt the Arabs into a revolt against their Ottoman overlords and create a diversion which would tie down the Central Powers in the Middle East. Ironically, the impetus for such a diversion had come not from London, but from the Arab world. In the Hijaz, in western Arabia, Sharif Hussein, its ruler, was set on extending his political and geographical domain. He believed he might be able to do it with the help of the British. In turn, the British were impressed by Sharif Hussein's family credentials as custodians of the holy places of Islam.
They called themselves Hashemites. They called the family Hashemites because that's the family or the tribe of the Prophet Muhammad. They were the Bani Hashim, the sons of Hashim. So Sharif Hussein was the leader of the Hashemites. He was the person responsible for Mecca and Medina. And although he had worked with the Ottomans before the First World War, once the First World War happened, he saw this was his chance.
A chance, too, for the British, who saw support for Sharif Hussein as a way to threaten the Sultan's hold on the Caliphate, the political leadership of the Islamic world.
The British, because they were fighting the Ottomans, and the Ottomans were claiming to be the real representatives of Islam, they wanted a counterforce. And the counterforce was represented by Sharif Hussein, being a descendant of the Prophet. But Sharif Hussein was speaking of liberating Arab lands, building a new national state. He wanted to be king of the Arabs, not simply of Arabians.
In July 1915, Sharif Hussein smuggled a message to the British High Commissioner in Cairo, Sir Henry McMahon, offering to raise a substantial Arab force against the Ottomans in return for British support for Arab independence. In the ensuing secret correspondence between the two men, Sharif Hussein was given to understand that he could expect British support in achieving some of his ambitions in the event of an Ottoman defeat. This letter of October the 26th, 1915, outlined the main points of the arrangement.
The actual document itself is absolutely riven with ambiguity. There's no doubt about that. The question is whether Hussein recognizes that. My sense of Hussein is that he does recognize it. In other words, there is no wool being pulled over his eyes, because he's perfectly aware that if he's going to create a modern Arab empire, he's going to need some logistical, economic development, and that can only come from the outside world.
Taking Britain's assurances of support at face value, Hussein, together with his sons Faisal and Abdullah, amassed a sizable force. The new army was commanded by the young and charismatic Faisal, who had captured the imagination of the Arab masses in the quest for Arab independence. Yet even as Hussein and Faisal mobilized their troops, the British were preparing to sell them short. Back in London, in the spring of 1916, Britain was negotiating with France about the future shape of the Middle East. Behind closed doors, Sir Mark Sykes of the British Foreign Office had been meeting his French opposite number, François-Georges Picot. Britain knew it was vital to offer the French a stake in the spoils of the Ottoman Empire, should they win the war.
There was an awareness on the British side that they had made such huge sacrifices that one couldn't just ignore French ambitions, and that the French were determined to have their historical piece of the Levant.
Poring over a map of the Levant, Sykes and Picot personally drew in the areas they wished to see under their control. Their secret deal amounted to the virtual carve-up of the Middle East. In Area A for the French and Area B for the British, the imperialists intended to exercise power indirectly. They would appoint advisors and take charge of the finances in their respective spheres of influence. Then there was the area coloured blue, which was to be directly controlled by France. This included what was then known as Greater Syria, where the French traditionally had commercial and religious interests. As for the area coloured pink, known as Iraq, with its strategic ports, railways and oil, this was to be under British rule. The area coloured yellow represented Palestine and was envisaged as an international zone, except for Haifa.
What the British wanted was the oil of Iraq, and they concentrated on getting Iraq and getting away from Iraq to the Mediterranean in order to transport this oil. So they got Haifa on the Palestinian coast, and they got most of Iraq.
The Sykes-Picot agreement was a pretty shameful document, and I wouldn't attempt to defend it. But it was drawn up by people who were sort of operating under the old kind of balance of power considerations in an imperial frame of mind.
Unaware of these secret dealings behind their backs, Hussein and Faisal proclaimed independence and in June 1916 attacked the Turkish troops. The Arab revolt against the Ottomans had begun. The Turkish garrison at Mecca was soon overrun, and the seaport at Jeddah seized. By 1917, Hussein and Faisal's forces had pushed north and engaged the Ottoman Turks along the Hejaz Railway. The British saw the Arab revolt as part of its strategy for creating a military diversion against the Central Powers. In a pincer movement, Britain had launched a campaign from the southwest to ensure control of the Suez Canal and the Levant. And from the southeast, it was fighting to secure the oil wells of Iraq. All this to attack the Central Powers at their weakest point, the Ottoman Empire.
The Arabs hitched their fortunes to the British. They considered themselves to be fighting with the Allies. But at the same time, they were not merged into the British Army, that they continued to act as an independent army called the Northern Army.
While the Arab army advanced northwards, Britain's General Allenby had crossed the Suez Canal, and by the spring of 1917, his forces had reached the frontier of Palestine. The war in Europe, however, was still not going well for Britain. The attempted push through the German lines at the Somme had produced little territorial gain, and the cost in lives was colossal. In London, there had been a change of leadership. The new Prime Minister, Lloyd George, felt that the Allied war effort needed a fresh impetus. Although America had so far been neutral in the war, Lloyd George was convinced that could be changed. He believed there was one powerful group which might influence the American government.
Lloyd George thought that the American decision whether to join or not would depend critically on public opinion, and that Jewish support could tilt the scales in one direction or the other.
You've got to remember that the British Foreign Office greatly overestimate the political power of international Jewry, particularly the wealthy, financial and commercial Jewish elites.
What is extraordinary about this situation is that here you have, particularly the British, seeing the Jewish world as one collective monolithic entity. And in that sense, they start looking at the role of the Jews in the war as being something which might be important. And from the point of view of the Allies, something else quite remarkable, this monolithic collective entity is pro-German.
Many Jews in the upper echelons of German society did indeed have close connections to the Kaiser's Foreign Office. A new Jewish nationalist movement, Zionism, had also been able to establish its headquarters in Berlin. Zionism had originated in the 1880s after Theodor Herzl published a book espousing the virtues of a Jewish state. This caused a sensation amongst Jewish intellectuals in Germany, Austria and Russia, who shared Herzl's outrage at the escalation of anti-Jewish sentiments.
The end of the 19th century saw the rise of anti-Semitism all over Europe, in Austria, in Germany, in France, but particularly in Eastern Europe, in Poland and in Russia. And the pogrom against the Jews in Russia gave rise to the establishment of Hovevei Zion, the lovers of Zion, societies in a number of Russian cities who started to promote and to finance and to sponsor colonization, emigration to Palestine. Herzl came to the conclusion that the Jews were not safe anywhere in Europe, and the only solution was for the Jews to have a state of their own over which they could exercise sovereignty and where they would not be a minority.
What had also given Zionism its appeal was the way in which it fitted in to historic Jewish aspirations. Scattered throughout the world since the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in the 1st century AD, many Jews had cherished the idea of returning one day to what their scriptures had told them was the Promised Land. In fact, there had already been a small community of indigenous Jews in Palestine. But even when some European Jews established settlements throughout the late 19th century, the whole Jewish community by 1914 constituted barely 8% of the population. The Zionist leader in Britain, Chaim Weizmann, had been lobbying the government for a guarantee that in the event of an Ottoman defeat, it would support Jewish emigration to Palestine. By early 1917, Lloyd George's view of Jews as globally influential convinced him that Zionism was another nationalist movement which should be co-opted to the Allied cause. In March, Mark Sykes began negotiations with Weizmann.
There is a bee in the bonnet of people like Mark Sykes that actually the Jews do ultimately look to each other and look to their own interest. And if that interest, as they are being told by Weizmann, is what we really want is Palestine, they're prepared to believe it. They're prepared to go along with it.
As negotiations with Weizmann continued over the following months, the war deteriorated rapidly for the Allies. The German submarine campaign was seriously weakening Britain's merchant fleet. And although America had entered the war on the Allied side, President Woodrow Wilson was not yet willing to supply a significant number of troops. Britain's latest attempt to keep up the pressure on the Western Front soon became bogged down in the muddy trenches of Passchendaele. As thousands of young men's lives were wasted in another fruitless campaign, morale amongst the soldiers plummeted. But the most serious threat to the Allied war machine came from the east. Russia was on the verge of collapse. After massive defeats at the hands of the Germans, the war-weary country was disintegrating, with food shortages, strikes, and demonstrations. When the Tsar was deposed in a revolution, Britain and France became greatly alarmed.
The point is that once Russia and its war effort begins to collapse, essentially the Germans have won the First World War unless they bring the Americans in. There's no way that the British and the French on their own are ever going to defeat Germany.
In October, the British government received an intelligence report suggesting that Jews were a significant influence in the leadership of the Bolshevik Party, the new revolutionary movement emerging as the dominant force in Russia. Lloyd George feared that these communists would take Russia out of the war. With the Americans still refusing to commit sufficient forces, he knew it was time to act. He instructed his Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, to issue a pledge to capture the hearts and minds of the Jewish people.
His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievements of this object.
The Balfour Declaration was issued on November 2nd, 1917, just as British forces were occupying Palestine.
I would say that the Balfour Declaration has to be understood not as an idealistic gesture, but it has to be understood within the framework of British imperial policy, and Lloyd George was the main instigator of that declaration because he believed that it would serve Britain's interests.
But this was also the first time that any major European power had given official backing for the Zionist goal of making Palestine into a Jewish homeland. Yet Sharif Hussein had understood that Palestine had been promised as part of his deal for Arab independence. Anticipating Arab outrage at the prospect of a Jewish homeland in a largely Arab province, the Balfour Declaration had also stated that
nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine.
The declaration, nonetheless, appeared to indicate British support for Jewish emigration.
There were only a mere 80,000 out of some like 700,000 people in Palestine who were Jews. The indigenous inhabitants of Palestine were referred to as non-Jewish inhabitants. And that Palestine was being identified even at that stage as a Jewish land. And all the others had no defined identity. They were simply non-Jewish.
The Balfour Declaration was what it says, a declaration. It wasn't a treaty, it wasn't a signed agreement, it was a declaration in support of the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine.
In fact, the only treaty Britain had signed in regard to Palestine was with the French, the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement. On November the 7th, within a few days of the Balfour Declaration, the Bolsheviks took power in Russia. Lloyd George hoped that it would have the desired effect of appeasing the Jews and the communist leadership.
What is it that they supposedly so want, as Jews? Palestine. Now, the whole argument is totally illogical. It's a nonsense argument because these particular people, if one were to think of people like Trotsky or Zinoviev or Yaffe, some of the key Jewish leaders in the Russian Revolution, the November Revolution, these people, of course, are internationalists.
There were 15 to 20 Jews in the higher echelons of the Bolshevik party. Most of them were anti-Zionist, and after they came to power, soon after they came to power, they issued a declaration to say that Zionism is a capitalist ploy, a capitalist idea.
The wildly inaccurate intelligence report on which Lloyd George based his strategy was to have major implications for Britain. Within weeks, Russia's new leaders did exactly the opposite of what he had expected. Not only did they pull out of the war, they opened up the archives of the Tsarist Foreign Office and published the secret treaties. The very treaties Britain had engineered with her allies to carve up the Ottoman Empire, and to which Russia had been privy.
That, of course, is a very great embarrassment to the Western Allies, because the Allies have been doing all sorts of deals behind the scenes in which they have handed out to each other large sections of the world, meanwhile openly preaching that they are fighting the war in defense of democracy, and of course also telling, among others, the Arabs, that they are supporters of self-determination for the peoples of the Ottoman Empire.
Publication of the secret treaties by the Bolsheviks certainly created enormous suspicion in the Arab world, and this meant that the Sharif Hussein and the others said, wait a minute, what's going on? Why are you not giving us independence? And secondly, why are you dividing us up into Zone A and Zone B? And at that point, of course, the Arabs realized that not only had the British got their own particular interests, for example, in the ports of Palestine or in Iraq, but that they had promised other things to the French.
Amid Arab confusion and suspicion, General Allenby entered Jerusalem on foot, together with Sykes, Picot, and a number of other Allied notables. His British-led forces had captured the Holy City in December 1917. The leaders of the Arab revolt, however, were nowhere to be seen. Fearing that Hussein and Faisal might lose heart, the British government forwarded a message to them, reiterating British commitment to Arab independence.
The Arab race shall be given full opportunity of once again forming a nation in the world. This can only be achieved by the Arabs themselves uniting, and Great Britain and her allies will pursue a policy with this ultimate unity in view.
Hussein stayed loyal to the Allied cause, still prepared to accept Britain's word on Arab independence, although he spoke of settling accounts after the war. From Allenby's point of view, he continued to rely on Arab support in the war against the Ottomans. But now that Jerusalem had been occupied by the British, one party seized the initiative. In April 1918, Chaim Weizmann and the International Zionist Commission traveled to Palestine to lay the foundation for a Hebrew university. Their hope was that it would become the intellectual hub of Zionism. Weizmann's visit, however, caused widespread alarm and indignation among the Arab population. And when he and the chief rabbi of Jerusalem met General Allenby, it looked as if Britain was preparing to honor the Balfour Declaration. Six months later, Allenby's forces entered Damascus. With their ally, Faisal's Northern Army, they had pushed the Ottoman troops north through Palestine into Syria.
The Arab revolt did contribute to the victory of the Allies. First of all, it protected the British flank in Palestine. Second, it kept a number of Turkish and German troops preoccupied. And third, the British could have never legitimized what they were doing unless they had the blessing of a particular Arab force.
On the 3rd of October, the people of Damascus flocked to Faisal's victory parade. If he was to seize power, he knew it was of great importance to make his presence felt and to be seen by the Arab people as their liberator. Later the same day, however, Faisal met with General Allenby at the Victoria Hotel in Damascus. Allenby warned him that his rule in Syria would be limited.
The British, by that time, knew that they were going to hand over Syria to the French, so they couldn't actually accept Faisal as a legitimate ruler. All they could do is to pay him his salary and the expenses of his army and his administration.
Undaunted by Allenby's warnings, Faisal assumed the title of governor of Damascus. With the support of his father, Sheriff Hussein, he set about creating a power base for their goal of an independent Arab state. On the 31st of October, the Ottomans were finally defeated. And at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November 1918, the guns fell silent in Europe as the war with the Central Powers came to an end. The peace conference at Versailles began in January 1919. Representatives of the victorious Allies, such as the French Prime Minister Clemenceau and the American President Woodrow Wilson, gathered to sort out what was to be done with the former territories of the defeated empires. Now, the liberal use of promises by the British government had to be prioritized.
They did indeed make pledges to the Arabs, but they also made pledges to the Jews. And they also made pledges to the French and the Russians and everybody else. And these people saw the world as an imperial world. Not only did they want to carve out the Middle East, they wanted to carve out Russia. They thought this was the last great moment in which the imperial powers would be able to sit down and grab what was going, particularly since there was no one to stop them.
But Britain and her old ally France were up against the American President Woodrow Wilson's vision of a new world order, which promoted national self-determination.
Once independence had seemed to be a possibility, that this principle of self-determination, supported by the Americans, was going to be offered to all those who were to be liberated from former empires like the Habsburgs and the Ottomans. What the Palestinians wanted was an independent state.
In fact, Faisal had come from Damascus to plead the Arab cause. But the future of Palestine in the Middle East formed part of Britain's pledge to France in the Sykes-Picot carve-up. In the event, Woodrow Wilson's principles about self-determination were forgotten when it came to the people of the Middle East. Britain and France were free to go ahead with their agreement. But what of the promises Britain had made to the Jews regarding Palestine? Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, in a confidential memo during the Versailles peace talks with America, France, and Italy, wrote,
"The four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes, of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land."
That might sound like a warm endorsement of Zionism, yet further in the post-war memorandum, Balfour hints at a much more cynical agenda.
So far as Palestine is concerned, the powers have made no declaration of policy, which at least in letter, they have not always intended to violate.
The Versailles Peace Conference was concluded on June the 28th, 1919, with the creation of the League of Nations, the first global institution for peace and security. Its covenant provided that the Arab and other territories ceded by the defeated Ottoman Empire should be administered by mandates, which meant, in effect, that Britain and France were given the authority to impose their rule over the Arab territories. On November the 21st, 1919, François-Georges Picot, the co-architect of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and the French General Gouraud arrived in Beirut. And so began the imposition of the French mandate for Syria and Lebanon. The British forces, who had occupied the region since ousting the Ottoman Turks during the last months of the war, were handing over power to the French, thus fulfilling their wartime pledge. Faisal, who had been the governor of Damascus now for 16 months, had been consolidating his position. When he was proclaimed king by the Syrian National Congress, the French were incensed, and General Gouraud sent in his troops. By August the 7th, 1920, Faisal had been deposed and had to flee to Palestine. The promises to Sharif Hussein and Faisal of a single independent state were now a distant memory for the Europeans.
The whole issue of spheres of influence meant that what was at first appeared to be a willingness to accept a single Arab state, was in fact seriously diluted. And then on top of that, of course, the very fact of there being a French area and a British area meant that, in effect, this was the seed of partition. So you had both independence was denied, but also the unity of this area was denied.
The boundaries and governments of the Middle Eastern states that emerged bore the unmistakable imprint of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The French half of the previously Ottoman province of Greater Syria became the mandate for Lebanon and Syria. The other half became the British mandate for Transjordan and Palestine. In the east, the Ottoman area of Mesopotamia, which included the oil fields of Mosul, was given to Britain as the mandate for Iraq.
So this was basically the importance of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, to divide what is called the Fertile Crescent between Iraq and Syria and let Britain get access to the oil of the area and be able to exploit it in the future.
But British rule was initially rejected by the Iraqi people until Faisal was installed as king in July 1921. Britain hoped the limited power it devolved to him would serve to placate the frustrated demands for Arab independence. But Sharif Hussein expected more from the British.
He never gave up the idea that the British had promised him independence, not only in Arabia, but in Syria and Iraq as well. And he wanted the British to fulfill their promises.
Sharif Hussein's dream of an Arab kingdom ruled by the Hashemites was only partially fulfilled. For although his other son, Abdullah, became king of Transjordan, their old rival, Ibn Saud, swept the Hashemites out of Hijaz when he conquered the whole of the Arabian Peninsula. In Jerusalem, an administration was established by the British in the spring of 1920. There were no plans for devolving power in Palestine. Palestine was a land sacred to three religions. Jews were a small minority who had lived harmoniously with Christians and the much larger community of Muslims for hundreds of years. But the Balfour Declaration, promising Jews a homeland in Palestine, had been incorporated into the British mandate at Versailles. Palestine was thus to be open for new European Jewish immigration. With celebrations and parades in support of Zionist activities, it seemed as if the British were going to honor their pledges to the Jews and ignore Palestinian hopes of independence.
The Arabs had a strong case, but very poor advocates. The Zionists had a case. It wasn't as strong as that of the local Arabs, but they had brilliant advocates. Zionism is one of the greatest public relations success stories of the 20th century, and Chaim Weizmann exemplified these traditional Jewish skills of advocacy and persuasion.
Some of these skills were clearly in evidence when Weizmann and various Zionist groups helped finance land purchases and the building of settlements for immigrant Jews. At the same time, political and security organizations were created to support the emerging Jewish homeland. The Arab community in Palestine was incensed.
The Palestinians couldn't conceive their country being divided or given away to another community which had nothing to do with the Middle East in the first place and was almost wholly European at the time. So to them, it seemed absurd that 600 to 700,000 should give up their land, their homes, their villages, their towns, and hand them over to a minority which was dispersed throughout Palestine. And Palestine, after all, is named after its people, who are the Palestinians.
In 1925, Arthur Balfour toured the new Jewish settlements in Palestine. Although he was feted as a hero of the Zionist cause, the immigration of European Jews was to have unforeseen consequences for British rule in Palestine.
I believe that the Balfour Declaration was one of the most serious mistakes in British imperial history. It committed Britain to support of Jewish nationalism in Palestine after the war, and it did not produce any immediate benefits for Britain.
Without the Balfour Declaration, there could have been no genuine development of a Jewish national home, and the follow-through in 1948, where you get the creation of a State of Israel, simply would not have happened. It requires the umbrella of the British to be there, in effect, to support the emerging Jewish national home, militarily at the bottom line. The very fact that there are British troops, British policemen there to protect the Jewish communities is ultimately central to the situation. It could not have been done in any other way.
Throughout the 1930s and 40s, the years of Nazi persecution and the Holocaust, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased rapidly. But what was seen by the Arabs as an alien incursion and the Jews as a fulfillment of historic rights led to polarization and violence. In response to terrorist acts by Arabs, Britain restricted the immigration. But the policy only stimulated Jewish terrorism. Against this background, Britain relinquished its mandate, and the State of Israel was born in 1948. When the first of several wars between the new state and its Arab neighbors began, thousands of Palestinian Arabs fled their homeland. Thus, the strategies employed by Britain to win the First World War inadvertently left a deep divide between Arab and Jew.
The most serious consequences of British policy during the war was the encouragement of Arab nationalism and Jewish nationalism. And in the aftermath of the First World War, Britain was left with this legacy of double-dealing and of betrayal, which was to haunt her for a long, long time.
Clearly, it played a role in dividing the Arab world into different states, in allowing the establishment of the State of Israel, and in frustrating Arab desires. But if what happened in Sykes-Picot and everything else that happened in the First World War is used as an excuse for the problems of the Middle East now, I think that would be a mistake. But yes, the roots of what we see today certainly arose from the double-dealing of the First World War and from the frustrated expectations of that time.
All right, and that is not all. Other of the issues that we have to understand is that this is working against Israel, because Israel is crossing the line again with the same actors that supported them and betrayed the Arabs and betrayed the Palestinians, displacing in those days more than 800,000 Palestinians that were with their mouths open on disbelief or how a foreign country was taking over with the support and the army of the British, because we have to remember, as you just saw, the mandates were for France and the British, and it was very convenient to find Herzog initiative in order to create a Zionist state with the super rich people, the most influential people, which were, of course, coming from capital in Europe. And the reason why they didn't like the Jewish people, which they don't dare to educate their own people on why They have been hated all around the world. Ben Shapiro doesn't explain that. Nobody does, except maybe other Jewish people that are a little more responsible, but that are being, of course, taken away from the mainstream media, like Noam Chomsky, like in this matter, for example, regarding Palestine and the state of Israel. Norman Finkelstein, Aaron Mate, the son of Gabor Mate, a doctor. Also, all of these people Jewish. Naomi Klein, etc. Even I might get cancelled in this program. The intention here is to find truth, justice, accountability, responsibility, to find peace. And I want you to remember that there's other situations around the world that are similar to the situation in Palestine and between Israel and Palestine. And that is, for example, the peace that was agreed between Ireland and England or the UK. Because this endless war, that it was also one of the characteristics of the imperial attitude towards that they found unacceptable, the dominion of the English upon them with the military boot and no rights whatsoever. There was peace reached between these two countries. The other example I would like to use will be what is happening right now in one of the countries that spoke itself and the head of the president of that country, which has been criticized by the United States and the ambassador in that country. I'm talking about the president of Colombia, one of the countries in South America that has been through war for more than 200 years. If you want to talk about terrorism, Central and South America have been fighting terrorism since 1492, the day that we celebrate today. This program is being produced the 12th of October 2023. In that state, Colombia, they created a jurisdiction especially for peace, la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz. This jurisdiction found many opponents, far-right opponents, people that like war, and people that enrich themselves with war, because they have the privilege to have more land than everybody else, while the peasants died of starvation, get assassinated, and the free thinkers, the intellectuals, teachers that wanted to teach others to think critically, to understand the differences between Marxism, Leninism, the difference between democracy and communism, the difference between good and evil according from the economics and politics of Adam Smith, and liberalism of the market that began with Adam Smith and was strengthened later by Mr. Friedman, and of course with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. The state is the problem. The markets dictate the policy and the development of the countries. It's the government that opposes and ruins everything, because we, the private sector, know better, and the corporations that are private show better responsibility and better management when it comes to managing the state, and they all have been proven wrong, because in the cases of the neoliberalism applied in Central and South America, in Europe, and the rest of the world as an imperialist tactic, as we saw in these last few minutes, is nothing but the same tactics that have been used for the last 40 years, of course, improved and more sectarian than ever before. Israel is part of that kind of attitude, which is an imperialist country with influence all around the world, and that is undeniable. It's not me saying it, it's senators, it's history, it's testimonies of scholars, including British scholars, that, of course, as you just saw, demonstrate to us, the country and the world, the history behind this conflict. I'm not trying to excuse not Israel, neither the organization Hamas that started this conflict last Saturday, but as you saw right now, this conflict didn't begin with Hamas last Saturday. And that's something that the Jewish people need to understand too. Because if they keep insisting on this belligerent attitude that they are the only ones that have the right to exist no matter what, and they can kill and destroy anybody else, is not a way for peace. The Colombian president, as I mentioned before, the peace treaty between is an example of it. We can do it with Palestine and Israel as long as there's justice, peace, reparation, and no repetition of these acts, and that includes Israel. Because I was wondering something. I was reading this commentary. Any Palestinian individuals or communities tied to these rallies in Western countries deserve extensive, pervasive, all-encompassing surveillance from local authorities until they either sleep up and are able to be charged and incarcerated or can be deported back to their countries. Apparently, the Prime Minister of Canada and the next Prime Minister of Canada agrees with this kind of politics because, like in the pandemic, you're not supposed to say anything against Israel and you're not supposed to say anything against the pandemic. And the actors that are doing this, that are supporting the behavior of Israel, like I said before this program, very conveniently, another 9/11, and we already have talked about 9/11 a long time, including with George Galloway, that was not welcome in Canada, and Jason Kenney accused him of being a terrorist and supporting terrorists and passed an edited video about it, and the judge absolved him from all guilty. George Galloway, I don't know if you don't know him. Him and I have had conversations every now and then when he let people speak in his program. He's a very hated person because he tells the truth as it is, and he was in parliament and has a political career for more than 40 years. This program is for truth and accountability because the experiences lived by this person, myself, I come from a country that's 60 years of war, and we know what corruption is. And what I find here is that as long as the mainstream media doesn't tell the truth about anything regarding this historical event that happened, and it's going to be in the minds of Israel and Palestinians, especially because they have been destroyed, literally blanked out, innocent people, babies being killed, 1,000 times more than the attack that the Hamas did against the Israelis, as always, because this is not the only conflict, and maybe the next program I'll show you some diagrams and maps, etc., that can clarify this for you. The attacks always supersede the attacks of the Palestinians against Israel, and I'm talking about in a proportion of 500% against 1%. 500% more attacks from Israel that destroy Palestinians' lives and did destroy Palestinians' lives throughout history. And as this little program is going to show you what was the politics of the Israel 7 days ago, 8 days ago. Like I said, I want Israel to have peace and not being attacked. I want the same for Palestine, and that is something that is just logical. And using Colombia as an example, because this person, this president, even though has been attacked by the ambassador of Israel there in Colombia, he answered him back and said, I condemn the attacks last Saturday against Israel. But you have to remember also that these babies, and the president of Colombia put the photographs of the babies killed by Israel in just one incursion. Speaking about the more than 170 people that have been killed just this year by Israeli forces, and that's on the yearly basis. So Israel needs to understand that, and that's why I mentioned Noam Chomsky, Norman Finkelstein, Aaron Mate, Gabor Mate, myself, and millions of Canadians that know history and are interested in history instead of just taking what the mainstream media tells you. What is going on. We are looking for peace in this program. I am looking for peace and understanding. That's the mission that we have, because as a protagonist and a survivor for many issues that happen in my country, bombs and people, pieces all around the place, that's a vision you don't never forget and you don't want to be in. So I understand what Israel is going through right now, but what they have done in the last week against the innocent people of Palestine is unacceptable and is a crime of war, which of course for Israel again, this time they might be accountable for it by the international community, including the United States and whatever country that supports them, because of the atrocities of revenge that they have committed. It's not me saying it, it's even politicians of Israel saying it. So let's watch this one.
And this issue of Netanyahu preparing for an invasion of Gaza, you talk about the immense undertaking that this involves, having to go literally house by house or building by building in Gaza to find any of the hostages being held. The enormity of this project.
First of all, to go from building to building is impossible already, because there were many buildings still down, and I'm not sure that how many buildings were left, for example, in the neighborhood of Rimal. To find the hostages alive, really, it's nice for all kind of Hollywood films. I don't see it happening, for sure not with this army, with its capabilities, as we were witnessing it only on Saturday. The invasion into Gaza has some other goals, namely to put an end to the rule of Hamas. And this is another impossible mission, because you can kill the current top people of Hamas. You cannot kill the ideology of Hamas, and they will always be replaced. Ground operation now is supported almost by all Israelis, because Israelis understand that we have to do something after this embarrassment, after this catastrophe. But in the same time, I must tell you, I can assure you that if Israel will go now for a ground operation, it will take a few weeks or maybe a few months. It will take so much blood of both Palestinians and Israelis, mainly Palestinians, obviously. And by the end of this operation, you will invite me again to Democracy Now!, and you will see that we are standing exactly in the place that we stood 1 week ago. Because as long as Israel continues to believe that Gaza, the problem of Gaza, will be solved by the sword, solved by brutal force, by emotions of revenge, justified emotions, then we will get exactly to the same place. This vicious circle will not be solved by power, not be solved by tanks, and will it be solved by troops, only by a political agreement, and above all, and first of all, lifting this criminal siege, for God's sake, after 17 years. This siege was about to guarantee the security of Israel. So what happened out of the siege, except of the suffer of unbelievable, inhuman suffer of 2 million people? What did it contribute to the security of Israel, this siege? You see the outcome.
We just have less than a minute, Gideon. I wanted to ask you the difference of the cry, the call of the families of the hostages, of older people, of young people, of children, the family members, one after another, talking about being, for example, a peace activist and saying, please use restraint. And the contrast between that and President Biden, as he addressed the nation yesterday, deciding consciously, and in the readout of his conversation with Netanyahu a few minutes before he spoke, saying they did not call for restraint. Your response, how important is the President of the United States' position here? We have less than a minute.
In less than a minute, I can tell you, Amy, that last night when I was watching President Biden, I really envied you, Americans, that you have such a leader. I never thought so before last night. But last night, Biden was a real leader, someone that you can trust because he was extremely sincere, and someone that you can rely on. If Netanyahu would have taken the same speech, he wouldn't be Netanyahu. Netanyahu is busy with politics, and here comes this Biden and tells Israel what Israel wanted to hear. I would love him also to say some things about the Palestinian suffering, the Palestinian agony. He ignored it totally, and this is very regretful. But by the end of the day, this is what Israel needs now, some kind of leadership, and it totally lacks it. Nobody is around really to understand that we have to go for a new way. Nobody is there.
Gideon Levy, we want to thank you for being with us, an award-winning Israeli journalist and author, columnist for the newspaper Haaretz, a member of its editorial board. We'll link to your most recent piece, Israel Can't Imprison 2 Million Gazans Without Paying a Cruel Price. His books include The Punishment of Gaza.
So as you can see, I'm trying to unite the people because here in Canada there's Jewish people, there's Palestinians, and we need to understand each other. We don't need to go and fight against each other, but history has to be backed, and the consequences of what Israel is doing is against Israel, it's not for Israel. Revenge in this way, killing women and children like they're doing in the last few days, is not a way to win the hearts and minds of the people. Israel is not the way, guys. And even if the prime minister, like he did with the pandemic, and the new prime minister, probably he just said that he's going to do the same, goes against his own citizens because they understand history and are against the propaganda and the speculation and lies that the government always tells us, like in the pandemic, we have to protest and react today. Much to say. Let's watch this other clip.
Yeah.
How are you feeling about being called up?
Good. I want to call up.
Why?
It's important. Because it's important. Because it's my country. And I need to protect her and my family and my people.
Internationally, lots of people have concerns about what's happening to the civilian population in Gaza. Do you have concerns about that?
I will tell you about the civilian, no more civilian, because when I saw them attacked children when they arrive into this place, I don't care about them anymore. If before I care about children and women and old people from the other side, no more.
Few in Israel are focused on the terrible images coming out of Gaza, but there is still a left-wing movement calling for restraint and reflection.
If you compare the standard of living of Israel and Palestine, it's crazy. They cannot run to the sea. It's an open prison. There's walls that are 50 feet high, 20 feet high in many places. Concertines of steel that is pretty sharp. These people have been living in poverty for 75 years. Would you like Canada to have the United States come to Canada and say, okay, you don't like us anymore, or you broke with us because you have a different understanding of the world, so now we're going to oppress you, we're going to war against you and destroy you and put walls around the borders and even in the North Pole because you didn't accept what we want to say and how we see the world and you don't want our imperial ambitions. So as you saw in the documentary, the same people responsible for the betrayal of the Palestinian people and the betrayal to the Arab people are the same people that are right now, France, England, and the United States, Europe, 27 countries, against Palestine and justifying the assassination and killing of innocent people. That I don't convey to that, and I expect from Canadians to understand this and to protest against the Prime Minister if he keeps insisting on supporting Israel no matter what, because what we are seeing and not seeing in the mainstream media and the interruptions to the people that speak the truth to power are being interrupted. Okay, we have no time anymore, and they just cut them off. The Deutsche Welle, and that's another issue. The mainstream media, as in the pandemic, is responsible and should be accounted and criminalized for lying and for being an assault against its own profession, which is to tell the truth, not partially, not half truth, but truth that has been backed up by facts, truth, testimony, even in judicial courts. Here in Canada, people are not that stupid, and I hope that in Europe people demonstrate the same. I'm not saying that we have to forget what happened against Israel. I'm very sorry for that. I am familiar with that. We have seen people, like I said. If you go to Colombia, for example, Guatemala, where 300,000 people were assassinated because the American wanted to take control of the bananas. Oh, come on. Just remember, in 1953, the United States deposed an democratically elected president in Iran and has done the same all around the world So don't come to us Canadians to tell us that the Prime Minister don't know history, because he perfectly knows, and if he doesn't, we are teaching you. Prime Minister, and we are schooling you. Mr. Poliev, if you're going to become the next president, the next Prime Minister of Canada, you have to be what these Prime Ministers and Presidents don't have had for the last 100 years. They don't have honor. They don't understand what virtue is. They don't understand what peace is. They are just greedy, imperialist bastards that have betrayed everybody around the world in the name of democracy. People are sick of this. Canadians are sick of this. Here in Canada, we deserve better direction, better prime ministers. And these two guys, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party that are coming, apparently are demonstrated that they are not fit to be in office to guide developed countries like Canada. The cost of living is going high. The price of energy is crazy to the top. Here in Canada, people that live on with the government assistance receive bills of $300 while they live on $500 that the government supports them with. They have to pay bills of $461 just in energy. In other words, they have $40 to pay rent and to eat every month. And what is the government of Canada doing? Nothing. And apart from that, they want us to go against Palestine people that are poor like hell, that have no electricity, no water, all the time for 75 years. And now we have to say that they are guilty? I don't think so. Again, I detest what happened against Israel, but if you understand that this is the consequence, not the cause, but the consequence of the cause of irresponsible, greedy, imperialist tactics, for more than 100 years, you have to be really dumb not to get it. And in this program, is directed to people that are not stupid, that preferably are read, and that have the duty to stand up and say, Prime Minister, I'm sorry, I'm here manifesting myself with the Canadian flag because you are wrong on this one. And not only that, the international community, especially the Arab countries, are going to unite. And that's something I have told you guys before. I don't understand why the Arabic countries have never supported Palestine. Never whatsoever. Create another country in Jordan beside Israel with a place keeping Gaza, of course, in order for them to have access to the Mediterranean, because they deserve that. Give them a territory. You have billions and billions of dollars and euros. How come you have never supported you Arabic countries, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates? You have left behind your own people. I know there's difference between the Arab countries. You saw it in the documentary. I can recommend you many books for you to read. Mr. Papin and many others. Noam Chomsky, of course, and Norman Finkelstein. But more present books, the one that I'm writing right now, and many others that if you were disciplined in understanding what truth is, you will find out. But our prime ministers are not interested in truth, but only in greed and to overcome with the World Economic Forum everything that opposes them. And that is not the way to create or develop a civilization. That is a way to create and develop a slave planet. And I'm sorry, but I hope that many Canadians see this program, read their books I'm recommending here, see the documentaries, literate, get into the books, read, for Christ's sake, and demand from the Prime Minister to get away from office, because if Canada, if the United States and the next President of the United States and in Europe keep assisting imperialist tactics that destroys whole countries, that keeps poverty growing, we are in the wrong hands. These people have not represented us for centuries, but Canada is lucky to be one of the best countries in the world up until the pandemic came. I'm sorry to say it, but we all know it. It's nothing but greed, corruption, and no virtue whatsoever, no honor. I'm a man of honor. I always have been a man of my word. And I think those are values that the prime ministers and the institutions here in Canada have forgotten. For us, for the country, for the world, hope to see you next time in the next edition of React Today as part of the World's Whale Project. Au revoir. Bye-bye. Hasta pronto. Peace between Israel and Palestine is possible. Take a look to Colombia. Ask President Petro. Justice, reparation, truth, and Responsibility, accountability, period.